Good morning and welcome to the sixth meeting of the Citizens' Participation and Public Petitions Committee of 2024. And in the dry way that we do, the first item on the agenda is for the committee to agree to take agenda item 5 and 6 in private. Are members content so to do, where we'll be considering the evidence we're about to hear and our subsequent work programme? Are colleagues content? They are. Thank you very much. We then move to agenda item 2, which is consideration of existing petitions, but an evidence session in particular. And I'm absolutely delighted that with a compendium of petitions to discuss with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Fiona Hislop. I'm absolutely delighted that she is with us, along with transport officials. Lawrence Shackman, the Director of Major Projects, who I think we've had the pleasure of meeting before at some point, and also Nicola Blaney, Head of Strategic Transport Planning, and Alistair Graham, Head of Design, Procurement and Contracts. A really warm welcome to you all. Thank you all very much. Essentially, I think, as the committee recognises that we are moving into the last year of the Parliament, in order to expedite a number of petitions, we hope to meet with Cabinet Secretaries in different disciplines to just try and work our way through, because otherwise we're not going to be able to do justice to them in the time that we have left. So this morning we are looking at petition number 1610, to upgrade the A75, lodged by Matt Halliday, and it calls on Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to upgrade the A75 Euro route to dual carriageway for its entirety as soon as is possible. Petition number 1657, which is the A77 upgrade, lodged by Donald McHarry on behalf of the A77 Action Group, which calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to dual the A77 from Ayr Whitlets roundabout south to the two ferry ports located at Cairnryan, including the point at which the A77 connects with the A75. Petition number 1916, which is a public inquiry into the management of the Rest and Be Thankful project, lodged by Councillor Douglas Filland and Councillor Donald Kelly. This is a project that's stretched across various sessions of this Parliament, and which I, in a different Parliament, along with David Torrance, I think, paraded around the ground ourselves to see what was what. The Government to instigate a public inquiry regarding the political and financial management of the A83 Rest and Be Thankful project, and which is set to provide a permanent solution. The PE 1967 to protect Loch Lomond's Atlantic Oakwood shoreline by implementing the high road option for the A82 upgrade between Tarbert and Inverrannon, lodged by John Urquhart on behalf of the Helensburgh and District Access Trust and the Friends of Loch Lomond and the Trossachs. And it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to reconsider the process for selecting the preferred option for the planned upgrade of the A82 between Tarbert and Inverrannon, and replace the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, the DMRB, based assessment with the more comprehensive Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance. And also, and finally, PE 2132, which is to publish a timeline for the dualling of the A96 between Inverness and Nairn by 2025, lodged by the Inverness Courier, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to publish a clear timeline for the dualling of the A96 between Inverness and Nairn, and the construction of a bypass for Nairn, ensuring that this timeline is made public by Easter 2025. Well, we'll be going some, I suppose, with that. I think I can see that we have a petitioner. My eyesight is never quite clear, but I think we're being joined by petitioners potentially in the gallery. And we're also joined by two of our parliamentary colleagues, Jackie Bailey, who has had an ongoing and particular interest in petition numbers 1916 and 1967, which the A82, and also the which one, sorry?
Rest and Be Thankful.
The Rest to Be Thankful, that's the one, sorry, is good there. And Emma Harper, who has an interest in petition number 1610, which is the A75, and 1659, which is the A77. The committee, there is no automatic right for MSPs who are joining us to ask questions, but I will at the end invite them just to follow on if everybody is agreeable, just to ask questions. It's been my practice to try and encourage as much active participation from MSPs in the engagement of petitions where they have a constituency interest. I'm less interested if they're coming as party spokesmen, but if they're here as a constituency interest, then I'm very keen to hear from them. Cabinet Secretary, in the light of all of that, I understand you'd probably like to say something to us just in advance of us beginning. I can say that we've kind of, rather than becoming a free-for-all, one colleague will take forward a kind of a discussion about each of the different petitions as we move forward, and I know you will bring in your colleagues as and when you think that would be most helpful.
So thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, committee. I'll just have opening remarks to provide a bit of context, which might be helpful. So I thank the committee for inviting me to discuss the petitions relating to the A75, the A77, the A83, Rest and Be Thankful, the A82 between Tarbert and Invernanan, and the A96 Inverness to Nairn. So the Scottish Government fully recognises the crucial role transport infrastructure has in supporting sustainable economic growth and access to essential services, and we are committed to improving transport infrastructure across Scotland. The Scottish Government has a strong record of delivering major infrastructure projects, including the £745 million Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route and the £1.34 billion Queensferry Crossing on the Forth Estuary, a complex engineering feat that has put our workmanship to the front and centre of global engineering. We've also delivered the Borders Railway, electrified the rail route between our two largest cities with the Glasgow-Edinburgh Improvement Programme. In addition, since 2012, we've invested over £475 million on the A9 dualling programme, which has enabled statutory processes to be completed for 10 out of the 11 projects, delivered the first 2 projects into operational use and supported procurement on the 3rd and the 4th contracts. On the A82, a new viaduct has been built on the side of Loch Lomond at Pulpit Rock, which helped to remove traffic signals which had been there for nearly 30 years. A much-needed bypass at Cray and Larrick has reduced traffic in the town by half, both improvements benefiting road users and local communities along the A82. On the A87, we have completed 5 major improvements totalling £64 million, including the £29 million Maybole bypass. In terms of the A75, we've completed 6 major roads improvement projects with a total value of over £50 million. And following an initial meeting with the A77 campaign group in November, I met both A75 and A77 campaigners, including the 2 petitioners, on the Friday the 21st of March. I'm happy to report that my offer to establish a regular 6-monthly meeting, bringing them together with Transport Scotland and AME, was accepted. While the UK autumn budget marked a step in the right direction, it does not make up for 14 years of underinvestment. Austerity can't be undone in 1 year, so we're still facing significant pressures on our capital budget, which is significantly affecting our ability to maintain investment on all of Scotland's transport infrastructure. So despite the significant pressures we are facing on our capital budget, we continue to progress improvements to the trunk roads network. So this includes the A96 dualling Inverness to Nairn, including Nairn bypass, with the procedural steps for the acquisition of land now concluded, delivering a further key milestone for the scheme. We also continue to progress work to determine the most suitable procurement option for delivering the scheme, and thereafter a timetable for delivery can then be set. Development work on the A83, Rest and Be Thankful, continues at pace with draft orders for both the medium and long-term solutions published in December last year. And additionally, following the allocation of funding from the UK Government, we've wasted no time in progressing the design and assessment work to consider options for realigning the A75 trunk road at the villages of Springholm and Crocketford, with almost 180 people attending the Meet the Team events held three weeks ago. So I'd like to thank the committee for giving me the opportunity to make these opening remarks. It provides a bit more current context, and I would hope to answer any questions the committee members may have on the petitions.
Thank you very much. So that traffic light's gone, and it's a while since I've been up that road in the 82. So the 30-year-old traffic light has finally gone, has it?
So that's the report to the committee.
Well, that's very exciting news from my point of view. I've not been up that road in a while. Cabinet Secretary, one of the things that was interesting to establish, I'm going to ask some general questions before we move forward, is Scotland's trunk road network is actually the single biggest asset that's owned by the Scottish Government. I mean, it's 2,170 miles long, worth about £20 billion. It includes a 10-lane section of the M8, and, you know, it has rural carriageways through the west to the Highlands. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. There's no single document setting out the Scottish Government's programme of trunk road upgrades. or the delivery milestones and associated budgets. Is there a reason why there is no single document that does that? So current plans such as the second Strategic Transport Projects Review and Infrastructure Investment Plan provide only a partial kind of picture of the planned improvements. Is there a reason not to, or is there an argument for a single document that could pull all of this together?
Well, there's obviously action versus bureaucracy, so that's obviously a tension for everybody in producing reports, and we can get criticised for producing too many reports. We do regular asset management, and there's two issues there. I think probably Parliament and indeed constituents are more interested in the additional improvements, enhancements, whereas actually a lot of what we do has to be about running the basic system, making sure that care and maintenance is there. I have worked very hard, despite the pressures on capital, to improve the maintenance budget. Why is that important? It's important for safety, and you're right in terms of assets. People take these roads for granted until something happens, and then there's obviously concern. But we are facing a situation where within climate change is here. We have real issues around stability of land. We have real issues around ensuring that we keep all our assets, and that's rail as well as road. And so one of the things that I'm taking forward across Transport Scotland is that kind of analysis of the climate change impacts and what we have, for example, for roads as we're developing the, we've had it before, but we're putting more attention to it, is vulnerable locations. Right. So, for example, I was down, when I was down on the 21st of March, I saw the Carlock Wall and the Carlock Hill on the A75. It was subject, the hill was subject to landslip. They thought they could put up, wires and catchment, a bit like we've done on the 83. But when in ground investigation realised they would actually have to drill in and have nailing in to have more security. So I think we've got to be aware that we have to take more, we should always take care of our major asset, but actually increasingly so. So in terms of bringing that together, I mean, we do have, I annually see my sort of asset assessment, so that exists. I might bring Lawrence in, so I certainly see material that gives me that kind of regular, what is the state of the asset. But I think there's an issue around then what we do make more public, because that's what people are interested in, is what are the enhancements, improvements, additional dualling, etc. So I think what you're saying is, do you bring that together? That might be a big effort. What we could do is probably signal where everything is if people want to find it. But Lawrence, do you want to?
Mr. Shatner? Certainly we have an annual asset management plan that's published, which summarises what's happened on the trunk road network in terms of maintenance and operations on a yearly basis, and what's going to happen in the year to come, where the pressures are, where the investment's been targeted. So that's published on a yearly basis. In terms of projects, we have obviously the infrastructure investment plan, which is a published document and is due to be refreshed in the coming months, actually. So that's a good summary, an excellent summary of the projects which are going to come into the programme, already in the programme, their status. So between those two documents, and there are others, I mean, the Transport Scotland website, for example, has a plethora of information on both maintenance and operation, and on the projects which we've got currently on the books and ones which are completed as well. So that really is a whole host of information which summarises both maintenance and operation and the project side of things.
Thank you. I mean, the process for authorising trunk road developments is a long-established one, 40 years old. Some would argue that the pace of some recent approvals for projects has been slower than it might be. Is there kind of any plan to change potentially the process, just to, particularly where projects have got broad public and political support, in order to expedite things?
So in terms of we've got the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, which is central. It was published for consultation in July 2001 and formally published in 2003, and there was a major update made in May 2008, and the next major update saw a refresh of the guidance in January 2012. 2022, so there has been progress in that period. I think the balance is obviously what the legal rights of people are in terms of that provision, and again it's the balance, is it the majority view prevails over the minority, perhaps landowner interest. A lot of the variation is at the stage when we're issuing the draft orders, if there are any objections, and that makes a major difference in terms of how things can progress. If you look at some of the issues where we're trying very hard, there's an awful lot of input in to try and ensure that there aren't objections, because obviously a public local inquiry can take a lot of time. I mean, for example, probably one of the biggest ones with a huge amount of responses is actually Sheriff Hall here, which has an enormous public input. But obviously, if landowners or others have key interests, there's a balance between, even though everybody in the granny might want this, if a few individuals don't, for good and understandable reasons, we've got to carry out due process. And I think that's the difference between the speed of how things have progressed, as if there are objections. And therefore, there's an impetus, and I've said to officials, and I think we've got some success, particularly in some of the more recent ones on the A9, where there haven't been, that allows us to move to complete. And of course, one of the key issues is completing that statutory process, because once we can complete that statutory process and try and avoid public inquiry if we can, then we can move on to what is the actions in terms of the type of procurement and actually the delivery of it.
Yeah, no, I can understand it. In fact, I seem to recall you and I had a similar discussion over the Pentland Film Studios, where it was a single landowner at the end of the day who was potentially frustrating what was a major project that could have proceeded at that point when you had responsibility for culture issues. The mutual investment model, does the government have, what is the current thinking in terms of that as a kind of method for funding trunk road improvements?
So we've been very clear, indeed, that was a statement made by my predecessor, Mary McCallan, when she made the announcement, particularly in relation to the A9, that we would be actively looking at the mutual investment model. It's a model that we are currently discussing in terms of market consultation that started on the 24th of February. There obviously are value for money issues. It will be revenue costly, we understand that, but in terms of where we are with our capital budget, I've relayed the constraints that we have, then there's an opportunity for balance there. What I have also made sure happens is the A96 Inverness to Nairn, the market consultation that is currently taking place is also including the potential, not saying it will be definite, for the A96 Inverness to Nairn, and of course for the A9, where the mutual investment model is actively being pursued. My officials are working very actively with Exchequer colleagues as the mechanism of how that will happen. So I'm working very closely with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on this. So this is live and active. It's only for the A9. It's only two of the sections. Yeah. So that is something that we are actively looking at. Okay. But of course, private investment and different models have been involved in roads previously, the Aberdeen Periphery route and also the M8.
And just a final kind of thought from me. I mean, you made reference in response to the first question I put to the fact that a large part of the responsibility is the care and maintenance of the existing estate. And I'm interested in things where something goes wrong. And for example, the M8 Woodside Viaduct, where there is suddenly a need for a major injection of capital in order to resolve the issue. Albeit we had petitions suggesting it be grassed over and various other things which we looked at. But what impact potentially does that have on the other projects that you are seeking to take forward?
So it does have a big impact, because obviously in terms of the plans, we can plan as well as we can. It's to try and manage that budget across a whole range of projects when we don't necessarily know how long they will take, because there may or may not be a public inquiry that could delay things from from original intentions. So that's part and parcel of the process. It can, and I think I'm glad you raised Woodside, because certainly when I went to see it and explained, and my colleagues can probably explain the more engineering aspect of it, but in relation to the pillars, the erosion of the steelwork within that is really problematic. Now, people don't see it because obviously it's propping up the M8 as it goes through the city centre, but clearly it had to be addressed. So therefore, one of the things I've ensured happened was that local councillors and local MSPs were invited to see it, to understand what this is, because people get frustrated because there's lane reductions, etc. But this is about safety issues, and to make sure that they're reducing the weight while the work gets done, and also importantly, the groundworks there, Glasgow. If those of you are familiar, underneath there you've got the subway, you've got potential mine, you've got a whole lot of different areas. So it's a serious piece of work that needs done, and therefore we have to stage and manage that, and to stage and manage that within a budget, which is very problematic. So, and things can happen in different areas. The A83 clearly in relation to the landslips, and thank goodness we put in the catch pits, because you saw the major closure previously, but the work that was done to ensure that when we've had again warm wet weather and issues there, we have to react as well as maintain, as well as improve, and that's the balancing act that we have to do with all our budgets and try and spread them over time.
I think this committee, when we have been out, we actually understand the geological challenges that are sometimes presented, and as you say, the safety issues. It's perfectly apparent from bridge collapses elsewhere what happens if you don't have a proper care and maintenance programme. It is essential. So thank you for all of that. And we now move to the various roads. Maurice Golden is going to talk to petition number 1657 on the A77. And Emma Harper, if you feel there's a question you'd like to ask, I'll invite you to come in after the colleagues.
Thank you, Convener. So we're moving to the A77 trunk road between Whitlet Roundabout and Ayr to the Cairnryan ports, approximately 44 miles of single carriageway road. Cabinet Secretary, how do you respond to concerns highlighted by the petitioners that the current state of the A77 is detrimental to trade with Northern Ireland and has left residents of the South West feeling, I quote, abandoned by the Scottish Government?
Well, I don't think they are. I think the level of investment that I recalled in my opening statement, including significantly the Maple bypass that have been looked for, been requested for a long, long time, is certainly major improvements. Currently, and I'm very familiar with it because it's where I grew up, is they're currently trying to improve the junction, particularly around Doonholme and Corton Road. I learned to drive on Corton Road, so I know exactly where it is. And there's the signalisation there's improvement at Kirkoswell for passing, because remember people are crossing. There's work there. I also saw the strengthening again, bridge issues, especially when you've got heavy traffic. The improvement of the strengthening of the Ballantrae bridge is taking place. It's taken a bit longer than people wanted, and one of the things I addressed with including the petitioners when I met them was the importance for communication, because it's really important when roadworks for understandable reasons might take longer that they're communicated appropriately. But your central point about the importance of the artery of the A77 and also the A75 in relation to Cairnryan is one thing I fully understood and understand. Indeed, I'm meeting with the South West Alliance ferry companies on a ferry tomorrow. As it happens, I'm travelling to the British Irish Council, and I've been very clear in my inter-ministerial meetings with other UK ministers that I want that an understanding that this is something that's important not just within Scotland but clearly in terms of that artery. In terms of also understanding, I declare an interest. I represent West Lothian. We have a number of supermarket warehouses. We have a number of. I was talking to shoes actually in the neighbouring constituency located there, so that they can actually access the Irish market. So there's a lot of traffic moves from the Central Belt over to Northern Ireland using that route. The other thing that might be worth relaying is obviously with the pressures on Holyhead, with the impact of storms, etc. There's a review of ports and harbours that we're taking place in terms of resilience, but that's happening with the Welsh Government and others. And part of that is what you do, and obviously the Cairnryan had to absorb a lot at short notice, again reacting to when lorries had to move up to to use Ken Ryan for a number of days to help resolve that situation. So I do see it as an economic issue. It's not just a local road, it is an artery, as is the A77, but obviously certain parts of it in terms of width, etc., and challenges are there, which is why I thought it was very helpful when I had my meeting in Girvan Library with the petitioners from A77 and A75. One of the things that we're going to work through is what they see as priorities. There are issues, for example, and some. I also met at the South of Scotland Convention, which was on transport, Councillor Gail McGregor, who's the leader of Dumfries and Gallery Council, and I also met last week with Councillor Martin Dowie, who's the leader of South Ayrshire Council, and they are comfortable with what we're trying to do to look at improvements. I think the petitions quite clearly, and it's quite a historic petition, have wanted dualling. I think there are challenges in making sure we're delivering the dualling that we've said that we'll deliver. I think to promise new dualling, I think, is not going to be realistic. And I would want to be as open with the committee as possible. But what we can do is make sure we're systematically working through issues. I was very struck in looking at the road. There's one point they pointed out where you've got it's south of Ballantrae, an adverse camber. If you've got big lorries, what does that mean? I also work very closely with the RHA, the Hauliers Association more generally. So there's parts of how do we help the industry. How do we understand what the needs are, and how do we then start systematically working through what is required? And that's what I've asked to be done for the A75 and the A77.
Thanks for that, Cabinet Secretary. Just to pick up on the improvements and upgrades and the point you made around facilitating trade internally, so to speak. I know that we already have major choke points once you get to the M77, particularly around junction 1 and 2, and that's before you either, if you're going to West Lothian, access the M8 or the M74. What assessment of the positive developments downstream is made on the impact of connectivity beyond that? Do you see what I mean?
Not sure. You just
because increased traffic flow into, the M77 is going to be problematic in terms of, if you're up in Newton Mearns and it's already clogged around Silverburn and those areas. And then there might be a petition saying we need to upgrade the M77. Okay, so I'm just wondering how, you model or look at the impact beyond the upgrades at hand, if you like. Yeah,
so I might ask one of my officials to help me out on this, one of these, but I'm very familiar with Silverburn and at certain times, and that obviously I think is more commuting. It's not necessarily you're talking about hauliers, particularly. That's road management, I suppose, and traffic management generally, and trying to manage that. I mean, that's quite an extensive piece of road. In fact, I also remember when that work was done through Pollock Park. You'll remember I'm not sure you're too young, Morris, to remember that.
Jackson remembers.
Yeah, you'll remember the protest.
I'll perhaps not want to dwell on that this morning.
Okay, but that was a major. So that obviously is not within too distant, in terms of how long it can take sometimes to do major road extensions. So that tends to dissipate. I know because I've got a family in Ayr, regularly up and down that route. So it tends to dissipate after Silverburn. So that to me is more of a traffic management within the kind of greater Glasgow and Renfrewshire, East Renfrewshire area. But I don't know, is there anything that MD wants to say about how we monitor that for implication downstream? Or I'm not sure there's anything. Is there anything else or not?
I think I don't know whether Nicola's better placed to answer this or rather than me, but as part of the Strategic Transport Projects Review, a lot of the transport issues across Scotland, or the modelling of transport issues across Scotland, is undertaking to try and identify the pinch points and where particular parts of the trunk road network or other parts of the transport network in general should be improved, and having a good basis for making those improvements, whether it's an environmental issue, whether it's to tackle congestion in particular areas, or whether it's to try and encourage people to leave their car at home and use the train or bus. Those sorts of things are what's tackled through the Strategic Transport Projects Review. and it should identify the main areas where improvements are warranted. And the STPR, or Strategic Transport Projects Review, has been undertaken twice now, and no doubt it will be undertaken again as transport trends and travel patterns change through time.
But the petitioner is actually south of Whitlets, Whitlets roundabout, and that's why not far from there you've got the Dunholm Road, Corton Road that I referred to. It's currently subject to roadworks with signalisation. Why is that increasingly important? I remember, coming out of that road, it went once the ferry traffic, and that's quite a long distance from Cairnryan, that you would be stuck on that road for a long time with the ferry traffic. You had to wait till everybody was through before you could pull out. Now, obviously, there's been major housing development in that area, more proposed, so therefore that, again, is looking at a pinch point, and that's why that signalisation, however frustrating it is for people while it's on, it's being managed by traffic lights, and that's what frustrates people as well, is that when work is being done, the delay, but actually delays quite often are perceived as major, but they can be 10, 15 minutes at most. Sometimes they're much less. But it is, if you're stopped, people just like to keep moving, so they get frustrated. But that's an example of pinch point that's been identified, but it's further downstream. It's on the, it's south of Whitlets, which is where the petitioner's interested in.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Convenient.
Thank you. Emma Harper, have you a follow-up question in relation to the A77?
So I've got follow-ups that are kind of linked to A75 and A77.
Well, can I bring you in then after we've had... Fine, that's fine. Thank you very much. Faisal Chowdhury is going to take us on to the A75.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. What reassurance can you offer the petitioner that the upgrade of the A75 outlined in STPR2 will be delivered in a timely manner and are sufficient to meet the needs of road users and local communities?
So again, my initial remarks identified some of the improvements and significant improvements that were made on the A75. I'm not saying that that's work done, it's not, and I think that's part of that systematic working through and also sharing and communicating that. Some of it is not always about the road, and this is quite a difficult thing for people to hear sometimes, but it's driver behaviour as well, which is why some of our local MSPs have been asking for average speed cameras, for example. There are a number, I think there's about 18 enforcement spots currently in terms of speed, because that is the issue around driver frustration and overtaking, etc., and when that can cause, quite sadly, fatalities and serious casualties. So, and I would rate it, actually road safety is one of the areas that I've also managed to increase budget and have a serious and enhanced look at. So in terms of the impact, it's not going to be about dualling. I've been upfront about that. I think that's also been reported to the committee in relation to this petition previously. But the bypassing of Springholm and Crocketford was something that was identified as a requirement, not just by ourselves, but also by what was then the Union Connectivity Review by Sir Peter Hendy, who is now actually a rail minister in the new UK government. And so there was a bit of delay, and I can understand it in terms of prior to the election by the previous government, and also delay after with the new government before the funding that had been promised could be brought forward. But I'm pleased to say that that has now, we've moved very quickly. We were ready and prepared to do the work that was required in terms of that, starting that first phase of what's required in terms of that design and build aspects, and there was a good turnout at the public meeting 3 weeks ago on that. So there's also, and I think actually A77 and A75 are connected, which I'll come on to once there's if it's helpful to look at it, because obviously when there are problems on either the A77 or the A75, they then have to use the alternate routes and also local roads for diversions. I think some of the issues there is about communications and also about suitability. And also there's a real danger nowadays that people don't use the diversions, they look at their sat-nav, and sat-nav can maybe take you, there's issues around, particularly for heavier goods, there will be roads that they shouldn't be going down because of width, height, etc. So one of the things that we've agreed with the A75, A77 group is we're going to look at diversions, and Amy are currently reviewing the diversion route along with Police Scotland, who clearly have a lead in this area, but also local intelligence can be very helpful in that. So, you know, in terms of the actions that I took from the meeting I've had with them, we're going to systematically work through that. And also identify, you know, share, I think, where we see that the improvements need to be made on that road and when they can be made, and see what the local insight is to see whether that, you know, marries with them as the priority. Not everything's going to get done at once, but I think if people see a plan of the order of which things are being done, they can also then take comfort from that. So that's what we're trying to do in relation to the A75. That gives you an overview.
Thank you. You've answered some part of my second question
right.
as well. Like bypassing, when can you give us an indication when residents of these villages can expect to see the bypass completed?
So again, I mean, this is where it comes into this process. It depends if there's, you know, when we start through the process of the process that we go through from the manual in terms of the design of roads and bridges and how we actually take that through. It's the first stage, so it's at stage one. And obviously, when we get to the stages where there are draft orders and if MD objects, then there might be a public inquiry. So to say to me, you know, tell me a date when this will be done, I can't tell you that, because it actually depends on, you know, a number of other factors that are out with our control. It depends on that process and whether there are objections to the draft orders. So in terms of the work on that, you know, it will be over a number of years, so it's not, you know, that's what is normal in terms of the process that this can take. But I don't know whether, Nicola, you want to add in where, you know, in terms of all things being well, what does that look like? And part of what might, and also can I maybe just reassure you that in my first meeting with the first UK Labour Government Secretary of State for Transport, and also with my meeting with this Heidi Alexander, who's the new Secretary of State for Transport, I did raise the A75 and the funding and the importance of that with both of them. And also Heidi Alexander has asked about costings, etc., for going forward, which will be in future years, which is understandable. But again, looking at the strategic importance, that this is an artery that's about, you know, referring to what Maurice Golden was asking, it's about the trade links in particular. So if I can reassure you on that. But I don't know if there's anything else you want to add without promising something we can't deliver because we're not in charge of the timescales of public inquiry.
Nicola, please.
Yes, of course. So the appraisal stage, you could say, has been undertaken through the National Transport Appraisal through STPR2. That's where recommendation 40 has identified the improvements to both the A75 and the A77. Now what we're doing on Springhome to Crocketford is we're undertaking the DMRB process, so that's the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges. And that's undertaken at a different stage from the appraisal stage, so that's generally focusing on informing the outline business case stage. So that's where we are at the minute. We've got another 2 stages to go through in the DMRB process. As the Cabinet Secretary says, that can take a number of years, because what we're essentially doing there is we are assessing route options as well as undertaking statutory assessments. So, for example, the strategic environmental assessment as well. And then at that point, we then take a look at, do we have the outline business case stage? And a decision can be made at that point. If that decision's made to progress, we then go into the full business case stage, where the focus is much more on the commercial and financial aspects of the 5-case model, but also at that stage and at each stage we are rechecking across all of the 5 cases to make sure that everything remains relevant.
Cabinet Secretary, can you, what other assurance can you make to ensure that such a project does not cause any further delays or significant inconvenience to A75 road users?
So clearly it's traffic management when you're doing the work, and what does that mean? Because that will be disruption when that does happen, although bypasses that are obviously off-road are easier to do because they're obviously not along the same the same traffic way and roads as people are regularly using. The other thing that can be done is trying to, where you can, do things at the same time as opposed to do things sequentially, if possible. And so therefore ground investigation works that we referred to, different things can potentially happen in advance. Now that's a risk because you're doing work and investing and spending public money in advance of decisions being made, but it also allows you then to try and not sort of catch up, but allow simultaneous work where it's possible.
Thank you. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener, and thank you again for giving me a wee bit of time here to ask a couple of questions. So obviously I am interested in both the A75 and the A77. We've had questions in chamber, and I'm actually really pleased to hear so many people turned out for the Village Hall meeting at Crocketford, and they will be happy to see progress being made. So, and I know that the Safer, Greener, Better document that has been put out by the Belfast Harbours, P&O and Stena working together, they've done a lot of work looking at the facts and figures and how this will benefit holidaymakers and hauliers and even commuters as well, in looking at both the A75 and the A77 in terms of Cairnryan and Ireland. So I'm thinking about, as we are developing the two projects for Springholm and Crocketford, what are the next steps? Is there a hierarchy or a priority of next projects, whether it's A75, A77? Is there continuous teams looking at, OK, what next, what next? I know Matt Halliday and I know Donald Macari really, really well, so I'm sure they'll be happy to hear about current progress, but also that continued, looking for the future is also part of that.
So there's other, I'd rather say next. I think it's at the same time. So I don't think we're waiting to, which is a process. We just talked about the process for the bypasses to happen before we make other improvements. There's also issues around electronic vehicle activated signage that can actually help in terms of speed management, for example, around Crocketford. We're also looking at short-term measures at the Hover junction and modifications to lines there. So there's also other things that can be done. And we also know that junctions quite often can be the problematic area. So improvements at junctions, improvements in terms of the layout signage, in terms of studying, road studying, etc. These are all things that we know can make improvements. And so therefore you don't have to wait until there's a bypass to make other improvements. So that is what we're doing in terms of the work. And actually I think that's why I think checking off the, I suppose the issue Police Scotland provide where the accident hotspots are, for example, and they're currently doing that in terms of determining whether average speed cameras should be deployed or not. But there are also that kind of point about the prioritisation of that that's improvement work. So you've almost got, the care and maintenance work, you've got the improvement work, and then you've got what we might call project work, which I would put the bypasses in terms of that project work. So it's not next, it's actually at the same time. And I think that check-off, and both Matt and Donald were in the meeting I had in Girvan. So looking at, checking that off with them is really important. But there's also really simple things that can sometimes happen that can make improvements. And if there are roadworks, and they are because we are making improvements, is make sure the signage is appropriate so that if you can still get direct access, you can, so you're not going through long diversions when actually local access is okay but throughput isn't. And also timings of ferries before works happen, because quite often work will happen overnight for safety reasons, but not starting it until after the last ferry's got the traffic off. So these are, that's not necessarily a level of detail as a Cabinet Secretary that I should get involved in, but I do think the prioritising communication and making sure that that level has been done at a local basis to improve things. These small things can make a difference to driver frustration, and we know that driver frustration frequently is what causes and sadly some incidents where distracted drivers or overtaking at inappropriate places can sadly cause casualties.
Just a wee quick one. Yep. And I recognise also that the ferry crossing between Cairnryan and Larne and Belfast doesn't close as often due to weather compared to Holyhead or the other ports, and it's the shortest crossing. So that's also for me, that's quite a good selling point for the importance of Cairnryan when it comes to Central Belt and the economy, which you've already mentioned already. So I think I wasn't able to get the closure information because they said it was commercially sensitive. But that's something that we really need to value, is the fact that the Cairnryan to Larne and Belfast stays open, and it's the fastest crossing as well.
So I think you touched on a very important point about how this is all connected, and also in terms of that resilience measure. Now, remember, our ports and harbours in this context, the majority of them are they're privately run and privately owned, and obviously the operators are private commercial operators, and so therefore sharing information can be sensitive. However, and that's why I think having the South West Alliance with different ferry companies together is helpful. There can be things that are in mutual self-interest here, and I think it's the mutual self-interest from the economic side of things that we're keen to identify and what can be done to improve things. And yes, you're talking about expanding. I think we also have to be protective to make sure we maintain the traffic that we do have, and we try and accommodate that and try and identify both at the whether it's it's road, rail, and also other aspects that can be improved. And I would say that's exactly the conversations I'm having with other UK ministers. So I talked to Minister Ken Skates from Wales about the consequences of Holyhead. They've asked for one of my officials to be part of their task force looking about how resilience is driven. And I want to take the opportunity of the meeting with the British Irish Council of Transport Ministers to advance this case of the strategic importance of freight through our main arteries and ports and harbours.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We move then to petition number 1916, which is the Rest and Be Thankful. And rested and thankful is David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and good morning to the other witnesses. Access to Argyll project, I believe in your opening statement, would be funded from capital budget. And as you know, this committee has a long-standing history of the Rest and Be Thankful, going as far back as session 4 in the Parliament, where we've visited and we've seen improvements to catchment nets, to stabilising the hill, to the old military road. So, Cabinet Secretary, what assurances can you give that the budget, the capital budget, in place is going to deliver long-term solutions?
So in relation to the plan, the project, the short, medium and long term, the route, and in terms of the option that was chosen, has been chosen, is now embarking on its initial, we talked about the design manual, it's going through its processes there. The short-term improvements, you've got obviously the catchment, you've seen one of the issues we had, actually, funny enough, we were in Inverary at one of the A83 task force. I think Jackie Bailey, as one of the MSPs, dialed into that meeting, but it was actually just before Storm Babette. And so we were hearing directly from Amy what was going to happen with the rainfall that was expected. And then a couple of days later, saw the consequences of that. So in terms of the short term, what's also had to happen there is some of the landslides have actually been wider than the initial areas that was identified as investment there. There has been significant work done on the medium term, which is strengthening the Old Military Road and bends, etc. And there's been quite a lot of work invested in the Old Military Road to help with diversions now, but also what will be required when the final design is placed on the long-term project, which is actually the covering and the project that's going to be there to make sure that the long-term sustainable future for that road is there. In terms of capital budgets, we are subject, as you'll be aware, that we don't keep pots of money sitting, as to say that's marked for the A83 only to be opened at such times as it is then to be invested in. Why is that the case? Because as we know, because we're only starting on the initial aspects of the DIMB, we're again issuing the draft orders. My colleagues will remind me when they went out for the, I'm just trying to check. December, yeah. So it was December that we've got draft orders out. That's the initial, so therefore we've got to go through that process. In terms of the end of the process was February, and I probably shouldn't say too much just now, but we're going through the process of looking at that. Hopefully, as again with other aspects, there isn't a public inquiry. If there is a public inquiry, that means that the capital requirement, that's what you're asking for, won't be necessarily in the next year or the year after. It could take a bit longer, and you've still got the statutory processes to continue. So the capital allocation will be required at some point. The major capital allocation for the construction will be required going forward. We have got funding this year to progress the items that we know need done this year, and I think that's important to put on record. But clearly going forward, and this is an area that other MSPs regularly ask, it is part of that, trying to manage the budget well in advance and when it's needed, and having it ready when it's needed to be deployed. One of the things I would say is that the 6 monthly task force report is open to all councillors, all MSPs. They don't always attend. They sometimes send researchers, etc. But there's an openness there that people can hear, and there's very helpful. So it's Bear. It's Bear. So apologies to Bear. It's Bear that provide a lot of the updates on the current aspects and improvements, and we also get from our engineers and consultants how they're progressing with the next stages. So I've probably covered quite a lot there, but realistically, part of the planning is to ensure that there's capital available when it is needed, and that's what we will be doing with the A83.
Cabinet Secretary, petitioners have argued that the development of a route on the opposite side of Glencroe would be preferable to a current interim message focused on the old military road. Can you explain why this option has not been taken forward?
So, I mean, again, this is historic, and obviously at the time that there were different options put forward, and there was major consultations that took place. We know, and there are people who insist that they want to have a different route than the one that was finally decided, and to varying degrees still argue that. But there are problems with all the different routes that were there. We are now quite well in the stage of the final design option, which I think was agreed in June 2023. I think it was actually. It was quite some time back. And there are problems with the alternates that people have said there. So therefore, it's kind of. And I think that's a challenge for the committee, is it's looking at something that has a history. You've obviously been involved in the A83 probably longer than I have as Cabinet Secretary for Transport, and it has had a long history. But what I would be concerned about is that if anybody in holding out for an option that was investigated, consulted on, but rejected some time ago, wants to hold up what the current provision is, and I would really worry for the people of Argyll. I think this is an essential work that has to be done to make sure that there's a sustainable future for the economy and the communities of Argyll. So I can understand and appreciate where they came from at the time, but I think we've moved on from that now.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, the petitioners have argued about usefulness of proposed long-term solutions for Westonbill Fangfield, and have argued for a tunnel or a viaduct. Why have these suggestions not been taken on board?
Can I maybe ask? It's okay if I ask Lawrence Chapman to come in on that one, please.
Yep. There were 5 main options considered before deciding on the debris flow shelter along the existing road, which is the long-term solution preferred option, which we published the draft orders on. Tunnel option was considered, a viaduct down the valley. Looking at the option of a route on the other side of the Glen was another option, and a bit of a hybrid option as well. And they were all assessed against a whole host of criteria: environmental impact, stability, a lot of engineering side of things. Obviously, cost comes into it, buildability. And the tunnel and the viaduct were options that were considered, and they did have some merits, but not to the extent that the proposed debris flow shelter has. So that's why they were rejected. And there's fully accessible reports on Transport Scotland's website, which you can look at to see all the reasoning behind that.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you very much, Mr Torrance. I wasn't sure whether you were suggesting Mr Torrance had been involved with the road longer than you, or whether he'd been involved longer than the road. But Jackie Bailey, would you like to just augment any comments with this particular route?
Thank you, Convener, and I think the road outstrips us all. But the petitioner, when they put in what is their second petition, is actually calling for a public inquiry into the political handling of it and the financial mismanagement, I think was their word, of the A83. I think things have moved on substantially, but I just note that their first petition was in 2012. So we've been at this a very, very long time. and we're at the foothills of things starting to happen. So I think we all appreciate their frustration. I wonder whether I could, in focusing on the future, ask the Cabinet Secretary, could she provide some more detail on, just in an indicative way, of how much will be needed and when, because I'm assuming you've done the profiling on the capital, and assuming, touch wood, that the draft orders go through and that there aren't objections and requirements for a full inquiry, what is the timeline likely to be now?
Okay, I am a bit circumspect about the draft orders and public inquiry because we're in a live situation just now, if you can respect that. In terms of the estimated cost for the permanent long-term solution, it's between 408 million and 510 million in Q4 2024 prices. And obviously, therefore, we need to identify then, in terms of delivery, how long that will take in terms of construction. There's obviously, and I think, significant investment also in the old military road, and I've inspected that and seen that, and anybody going through will identify and see that as well as the ongoing issue around the short term, because, as I said, even with the improvements that were made, obviously, as we're talking about, wet weather, increasing wet weather, ground saturation, etc., there's a lot of science been involved in monitoring water levels, which also allows us in advance to activate the old military road, which is required, which is different. And the other thing, and I want to probably say this publicly, is that we're also working very hard with BBC and STV. So when they are making announcements about what impact weather has, what we have been told locally is that A83 is still open even if it's with the old military road diversion. Why is that important? Is in the past and sometimes still they say the A83 is closed, and that implies that Argyll is closed, and it's not. So even, as I said, even things like that can make a difference. So we're working hard on that. It's a bit different from what you were saying. But in terms of the kind of rollout of spend, does anybody want to try and identify what's required when?
Well, we're at the present time continuing with ground investigation works, and there's cost associated with that, and trying to make sure that when we do get to the construction phase, as much information is known about the ground conditions. And obviously with civil engineering, most of the issues are the things that you can't see, what's in the ground, and making sure we know where the rock head is for foundations for that debris flow shelter, for example. But as we go forward, and obviously taking cognizance of what the Cabinet Secretary has said about the objection and representations period that we have at the moment, once that is out of the way, there's been a public inquiry if that's necessary, then we move on to the procurement stage. And we're finalising what the procurement will look like in terms of the type of contract that we'll have to put in place, bearing in mind that there's obviously an active hillside there, so a contractor will have some pretty strong challenges through the construction period. The procurement could take a year or 18 months or so, depending on how we factor in those particular concerns. And then the construction period would follow that, probably 3 or 4 years of construction, trying to make sure that we maintain traffic flows using the old military road to a large extent during the construction period. And hopefully we will get contractors who have got a good eye for innovation to make sure that the periods of disturbance to local users is minimised as much as possible, and that they obviously build the works in a safe and appropriate manner.
And,
So it could be 6 years, if I've picked you up correctly, with a fair wind.
Yeah, yes. I mean, it obviously will depend on the particular contractors and how well they are, and what the weather's like during construction as well, because if there is a landslide, then obviously that would have an impact on things.
And just to assure you, and part of this is also the momentum, is there is 18.5 million for this financial year on the medium and long term. So it's kind of making sure things keep moving. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
That brings us then to the petition number 1967, which is the A82. Maurice Golden.
Thanks. So, move slightly closer to home, I suppose. This is a petition that calls on the Scottish Government to protect Loch Lomond's Atlantic Oakwood shoreline by implementing the high road option for the A82 upgrade between Tarbert and Inverannan, one of 3 options considered by Transport Scotland during early project assessment. The petitioners have written to the committee on the 19th of March of this year stating that, and I quote, We are demanding Transport for Scotland conducts a full stag appraisal of the A82 Tarbert to Inverarnon project as required by law. Cabinet Secretary, what assurance can be offered that Transport Scotland has fully complied with its legal obligations?
So central to that petition is the point you're raising about a request on a stag process to be applied. So concerns regarding the application of stag guidance on the A82 Tarbert to Inverarnon scheme was raised with separately with Audit Scotland. So you're looking for a reassurance. It was raised separately with Audit Scotland in similar terms to those put forward in the petition. Audit Scotland investigated and confirmed to Transport Scotland, and I understand the petitioner, on they contacted Transport Scotland at least on the 15th of November 2022, that they had considered the requirements contained in the stag guidance and reviewed relevant evidence, and the auditor concluded that the stag process has been applied at the initial stages of the work on the A82.
Thanks for that. It's useful to get that on the record. Cabinet Secretary, earlier you mentioned you have different views, and I think that's one aspect of this petition, particularly supporting the high road option. And I know some correspondence from the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park Authority with regard to this. I wonder if you could, Cabinet Secretary, take us through the timeline for this particular upgrade and any consideration that you would like to put on the record regarding the high road option.
So clearly this one has completed certain of the phases. There are still issues as to whether in the next phase there would be any objections raised or indeed a public inquiry. There are strong feelings about this. People understand there are strong feelings actually about most roads in most places, but I think the issue there is probably one in relation to the landscaping and the natural environment in relation to the loch. Obviously, the early stages that the process has to address, and also indeed the 5 stages when it gets to the outline and strategic business case, have to look at environmental as well as economic, etc. areas. And I think one of the key things probably to relay is that consideration is being given to the feasibility and attractiveness of the route that has been chosen, which obviously the petitioners don't like. The consideration is being given to the feasibility and attractiveness of combining with adjacent schemes to look about, you know, how we can make sure that the tree line and the environment aspects are considered as part of that. So I think there's still time to go in terms of that process to address that particular point. I think there's also, a really important point to be upfront and candid about, and that is because of the interaction between the A82 and the A83, and the A82 being used particularly when there's problems with the A83, that we do not think it's appropriate to do work consecutively or at the same time on the A83 and the A82, and because of the safety issues and the importance to the economy and people of Argyll in particular, we would prioritise the A83 over the A82. So that's, I think, probably important to have on the record.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. And again, Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much, Convener. I've maybe got slightly more to say about this petition. Can I maybe...
Well, within reason.
Oh, okay. I'll hope you'll indulge me. I think, Cabinet Secretary, to date, the consultants employed by Transport Scotland have spent something like £19 million. Would you be aware that Work Package 1 of the contract actually requires the stag appraisal, which hasn't been done? Are you also aware that a design for the active travel route alongside the A82, as promised, also hasn't been done? And there have been suggestions that some of the cost estimates may be slightly inaccurate, and I wonder whether there would be a useful meeting to be had between the petitioners, Transport Scotland, and indeed the National Park, to just understand some of this. Whilst I'm talking about the National Park, let me add on a second question. At what date, if there have been any discussions with the National Park, did these take place? And the reason I ask that, you'll appreciate, because I think you know the area, just how sensitive that bit of the A82 is as it borders Loch Lomond. There is plans for the national park to regenerate and extend Atlantic Oakwood and the natural habitat corridors that exist there. And it strikes me that the Low Road option is probably the least sensitive in terms of respecting that environment. So 2 questions rolled into one, convener.
Okay, there is a lot in this, and with your agreement, I'll ask Nicola Blaney to come in a second. But just to reassure the member, I have met with the National Park more generally. I'm very impressed with what they're trying to do in active travel generally in that area, and absolutely understand their interests, and clearly as they have a statutory role in terms of planning, so I can understand where they will sit within this. I would say to the committee that by and large people want roads to happen as opposed to not want roads to happen, and people will want an improvement to the A82, but it's which one, and I can understand the sensitivity around this and appreciate that, and people feel very strongly about it. I think in terms of the petition, I think the petition has been dealt with in relation to has there been an earlier stag appraisal, and that's been, as in my answer to Maurice Golden, actually then been assessed by Audit Scotland and confirmed. So that's on that. It doesn't mean that there isn't continuing, or probably for the next Parliament as well, continuing interest in this road. I get it, and I appreciate the strength of feeling from the petitioners on that. But from a technical point of view, I think the petition has probably been dealt with. In relation, therefore, to those specifics about costs, I don't know where the sources are, but and the point,
FOI.
All right, okay. So that's
from you.
All right, thank you very much. We're very open and provide lots of information all the time. And in terms of, but communications is really important, and sometimes people just understanding what we've done, how we've done it, what the process is, can go a long way, and then you can focus in what are the real points of difference. And sometimes they can be resolved, but sometimes they can't be. But therefore, I think openness in that is quite helpful as well. And also in relation to the active travel route, that's something where, generally we try and ensure that there is that provision. But again, it'll be probably in the timing and sequencing of what happens. We'll need to address that. But Nicola may have more technical detail on that. That I think is probably where Jackie Bailey is coming from. So Nicola, do you want to help with this?
Yeah. Okay. So the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance and the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges are both pieces of guidance which, when adhered to, I would say represents good practice in the development of transport projects in Scotland. However, they're not applied at the same time or for the same reasons. I think I mentioned that earlier on. An appraisal is undertaken to look at a geographical area, and this informs the strategic business case. So the problems and opportunities that an area is facing is looked at, and that helps determine what we would call a case for change. Then a long list of options, often across all modes, is considered against a multi-criteria. And then that list is refined until you have an intervention or a package of interventions to then be taken forward. Whereas the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges is applied once that intervention for a road scheme has been determined. And at that point, I think I mentioned earlier on as well, you are assessing route options, which principally informs the outline business case stage. So STAG is not a replacement for mode-specific design processes, which would then follow on from the completed transport appraisal. I understand that the 82 Talbot Turnveran Upgrade Strategic Business Case report was published, and that built on the evidence from the National Transport Appraisal, the first Strategic Transport Projects Review, which was published, I think, October 2009. So that hopefully is helpful in setting out that context and where the differences are. I don't think there's probably much else I would add to that.
I think the only thing is actually it might be, if it's helpful for particularly in relation to, I would expect National Park discussion is not withstanding the current processes, but that openness with the National Park and to meet with them to go through where we are and what the implications are, and anything on the active travel route as well would be helpful.
There's been continuing dialogue with the National Park with the detail of the scheme and the makeup of the scheme, and one of the fundamental things is having the active travel facility through the whole of the scheme and incorporating that in a sympathetic way. So that is quite a challenge. The topography is obviously quite demanding alongside Loch Lomond and the surrounding hills there. So it is quite a difficult scheme to take forward, but it's been progressed in a sympathetic manner with due regard to all of the other environmental issues. You talked about the trees and all the flora and fauna in that area, and trying to make sure that as much of that is maintained as possible, and looking at how it can be replicated in various other parts of the route as we develop the scheme further, as we go towards draft orders.
Quick supplementary.
Oh, I'll try and be quick, Convener. I think the petitioners who are in the public gallery understand your reasoning but disagree with it, and therefore were quite surprised to see reference within Work Package 1 to the requirement for a stag appraisal. So I don't know whether that was just missed by officials or not. I'm interested then in your views on this being the best route in terms of traffic hold-ups, because you'll appreciate the A82 is an extremely busy route. If you actually construct on the existing route, the hold-ups will be a nightmare. They'll be catastrophic for that area. And so a high road option is, I think, better. I wonder what analysis you've done of the resilience of roads, of the traffic disturbance that would be caused by sticking to that route.
That's not a level of detail in terms of the traffic management and engineering that I will apply my capabilities at, but I'll ask officials.
Yeah. So I think.
Alistair Graham. Yeah. So it's your debut.
This is your access.
We should properly acknowledge your contribution as it starts.
Thank you, Peter. Yeah, so as part of the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges Stage 3 assessment, which is the detailed development assessment of the preferred option, you know, constructability is one of the key issues that we will be, well, we are looking at that, and we'll continue for that to evolve. And, you know, and we obviously are consulting with the National Park, as Lawrence Shackman has highlighted already, and so it's making sure that we minimise any disruption due to the construction phases, and that work is ongoing at the moment, and that will continue to be developed. And when we get to the end of this, the DMRB Stage 3 assessment, you know, reports will then be published at that stage, which will outline the developed preferred option and what impacts it would have during construction.
Supplementary. But very
absolutely,
brief.
but genuinely, as a local who uses that road, where are you going to divert people to? Are we going to have to go onto the loch to get round the construction? Because, frankly, that's the only way it's going to work. It is the most challenging roads project.
And yeah, that's acknowledged.
So I thought we were saying yes, we'd have to go into the loch there. No.
I think obviously as part of the ultimately citizen online, there will be closures of the road. Yeah, that would be, and but that work will be minimised as much as possible. You know, we'll try and minimise that as much as possible during the work that we're undertaking at the moment. And you know, we will be striving to keep one lane open during construction phases, so traffic can still use that during construction.
And that's regular. However challenging and difficult it is, that has happened. But I think acknowledging that is a major kind of route, and that's one of the reasons why we're not going to be able to do it at the same time as the A3. You know, I think everybody's fully aware of that. So the issue is, you know, it's a case of you know, the handling and the management of this, and it will be some time to come. Will be very, very important indeed. In terms of how you manage that. But as I said in my general remarks, you can't improve roads or have new projects without disruption. The issue is how that disruption is handled.
Absolutely, but I think just the point to make is not that we're against road building. There is a better alternative, Convener.
Stated, I feel in my bones that a subsequent petitions committee is going to be revisiting this issue in the next Parliament. That brings us then finally to the petition number 2132, finally, but by no means in any sense less importantly, the A96 duelling Inverness to Nairn, and I'm going to invite Fergus Ewing to take forward the questions on this. Having sat very patiently through the consideration of all these other roads, we get to the one that is, he will say, the most important.
Well, if we may travel from Loch Lomond up to the Inner Murray Firth, then could I ask the Cabinet Secretary a few questions? In her introductory remarks, she said that the made orders were issued the compulsory purchase process will be completed. Procurement will then be determined, and thereafter a timetable will be set. Now, the petitioner convener asked for this timeline and a completion date for the dualling of the Inverness to Aldern section of the A96, including their bypass, to be published by this Easter. Although I don't want to dwell on what now is classified as ancient history, the pledge to deliver a near bypass was first made by our party Cabinet Secretary in 2009, and it became a government pledge in 2011. It's been repeated, as far as I know, at 7 general elections. That must make it the daddy or the granddaddy of all pledges, the longest undelivered promise of the Scottish Government that is extant now. So, can I ask one very simple question to the Cabinet Secretary? Will she today provide a clear and unambiguous assurance that before the end of this session of Parliament, a ministerial statement will be issued setting out a detailed timetable for the delivery of the dual road between Inverness and Aldern, including the Nairn bypass, including in the statement a firm date as to when the work will be completed?
So the petition is specifically about a timetable to be declared before Easter. As far back as last summer, I was making it very clear and publicly and openly that a timetable could only be determined once we understood, well, we'd completed the full stages of the process, and that's why completing that final stage and acquisition of land, which will obviously we can't progress until we have acquisition of land. The acquisition of land will take place from the 21st of April this year, so that is a definitive point in terms of where we can move to the next stage. And as I have been quite clear and open, the timetable will be determined by the type of procurement that we progress. Ideally, use of capital gives us more control in terms of different aspects and timescales. The other aspect, which again I have been open about, is it depends whether we do all of it in one package, whether we align it with the Inches to Smithton, which we're also looking at, or whether we progress the bypass as an initial on its own aspect. It was quite clear that there's really a need to get the bypass aspect of this done very early. So I don't know where the Easter date came from. The first I ever heard of an Easter date was from Mr Ewing himself, so I'm not sure if Mr Ewing has been involved with the petitioner in terms of determining the content of the petition that came before, but the Easter date has come from a different aspect.
With respect, Cabinet Secretary, I mean, my question really, I mean, we've know all that, and you said all that, and, you know, we're not on just a minute here with repetition, deviation, hesitation. We're in Parliament and we want an answer. And the question was, will the statement be issued before the end of this session of Parliament? Yes or no?
So I'm here to answer to the petition specifically, and that's why for all of the different roads that we've discussed, I've tried to focus my remarks on the petition that is in front of us. In relation to the determination of the timetable, what I can assure the member of is in terms of looking at the potential for the mutual investment model to be used, that the Inverness to Nairn, including Nairn bypass, is being consulted on as part of that engagement with industry that started on the 24th of February. So clearly in the conclusion of that, we'll be able to identify what the proposal is. Would I want to make a statement, and would I be open to making a statement on the A96 Inverness to Nairn bypass before the end of Parliament? Of course I would. But in terms of where I would want to be, I'd want to be able to provide as much information as I can.
Okay,
and so therefore it's related to...
Well, the answer is no, you're not making that assurance,
no,
Cabinet Secretary, I'm afraid.
I don't think that.
Well, you haven't given it. I've asked you for it and you haven't given it. So could I move on then to the next question, which is this, that the capital budget of the Scottish Government at the moment for 24-25 is £6.2 billion, 6,200 million, of which 4,700 million comes from HM Treasury. The cost of the work I'm talking about is considerably less than that, and that is just 1 year's budget. So surely, given that there hasn't really been any substantial investment, convener, in major road improvements in the Highlands, and of course in the rest of Scotland, we have seen welcome improvements. I welcome that as a Scot, and that's great. But we haven't seen them in the Highlands. So our argument, and the Inverness Courier's excellent campaigning efforts are exactly the same and aligned with mine, is that it is the Highlands' turn. And the government has repeatedly promised that these roads will be delivered, the A96 by 2030. Well, so far we've spent £100 million, Cabinet Secretary, £100 million on the dualling of the A96, and not 1 centimetre of tarmac has been laid. Quite an extraordinary feat of profligacy.
Mr. Shearing for the Cabinet
The
Secretary.
question is, surely, if you look at the capital budget for this year and assume a capital budget of 4 to 6 million for the years ahead, and that's what it's been historically, there is more than enough money to fund this project from existing capital. And therefore, are you not able, Cabinet Secretary, to say that if the use of public finance and the consultation concludes that that is not the right option, you will nonetheless be able to provide the assurance that the funding can come from the existing capital budget, which is plainly more than sufficient to do it, provided the Highlands are treated as a priority?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there's clearly a great deal of investment and capital in the Highlands. I'm happy to write to the Minister to relay all of that. I'm very pleased that in my opening remarks I talked about the procurement of the third and fourth contract for the A9, and indeed the work is commencing on the Tomatin to Moy section of that, and there'll be further work on that. I think in terms of the issue around the investment in the A96, I think his question about the he used the figure 100 million being invested on the Inverness and A96 issue. It's not. I've written recently to Douglas Ross, who raised the same issue, and I'm happy again to share my response to him. I can advise that the spend to date is approximately £33 million for Inverness and Nairn. Why is that important? Because the costs are the engineering design, environmental assessment, traffic, economic assessment, stakeholder engagement, supervision of ground investigation works and topographical survey works. These all have to be done. Now, if I refer the member to the types of work, the Lower Thames crossing, for example, is a £9 billion project, just recently been approved. £1.2 billion of planning has gone into that already, although it's not been built. So, of course, you're going to have engineering and other works invested, and it's £33 million. And I think it's always important to be accurate when we're reporting things to Parliament, and that's what I intend to do. In terms of...
Can I just address that?
Just a pause till the Cabinet Secretary's finished.
There was a lot of issues and raised by the member, and understandably, and I know he's felt passionately about this for a very, very long time. So in terms of the investment in my budget, in the transport budget, the vast majority of that capital budget that he relays, which is a big figure, is on rail. And on maintaining our capital investment for our ports and harbours, and is also on the subject that we just started with, which is the maintenance of our roads, basically to make sure that they are safe. So the vast majority of that, in terms of, it's well over £1 billion in relation to rail, and that's not on the running costs, but certainly on the capital investment. So the idea that I have, availability of capital that can be on any one particular road, it has to be very carefully budgeted for and calibrated. There is investment in for the A96 for this year that is available. I would be looking to help identify what the future investments are. And again, we've been very public about what the costs were for that in 2014. And also, when the member said that I'm not prepared to give a statement, I said, yes, I am open to giving a statement. But anybody who's experienced with this Parliament knows that it's not me that decides if I make a statement. It's actually Parliament who decides who and when makes a statement. So yes, I am open to making that statement.
Could I just say that the figure of 100 million comes from the Transport Scotland's figure of 90 million, which applies to the whole A96 project, which was valid last summer, adding on to that the compulsory purchase costs, which you've estimated and mentioned. That's 100 million, but that's a detail. I mean, could I just put to you this, Cabinet Secretary, and see what your answer to this is? I mean, is it not the case that there has been, sadly, delay in the processing of the various milestones of this project? And could I just refer you to the Transport Scotland document, which I have here, which is dated February 2016, which states that the the draft road orders and compulsory purchase orders were to have been issued in 2016. Now, they weren't finalised until 2024. Now, that process took 8 years. That must in itself be a record. Is it not the case that the Scottish Government has quite deliberately delayed the completion of the necessary statutory processes because it seems even now to be unwilling to give a categorical, unambiguous assurance that the promises that we have made collectively as individuals, as politicians, for the last 14 years will in fact be funded by the Scottish Government whilst we see projects in other parts of Scotland going ahead? Is that delay not really been quite deliberate, Cabinet Secretary?
Well, I don't think it's deliberate. I think that's your question is interpretive and assertive in taking an opinion, and you're entitled to an opinion. But in terms of the timescale of that, I will run through in November 2016 draft orders and environmental statement was published. There were 154 representations, including, interestingly, 127 objections following the publication of the draft orders. Now, that led in, at the end of 2018 into a public local inquiry to consider unresolved objections. Now, I think I've already relayed in relation to the other issues, the time that can be taken up by public inquiries is necessary. It's a process. Should there be significant objections? It is why I have been encouraging the Transport Secretary as much work to be done in advance with interested parties to try and avoid that. So that was in the period of the... And then October 2019, the Public Local Inquiry Reporters Report was submitted to the Scottish Government. February 2021, which obviously were in the, that period was also in the pandemic period, you'll be aware. The decision to proceed was announced following consideration of the objections, along with, importantly, reasoned conclusions and recommendations of the reporters. And then, this is where I recognise there has been a delay, the March 2024 publication of made orders for the scheme, providing Scottish ministers with the powers to acquire the land necessary to build the scheme. So that was in March 2024. March 2025, which is just recently, procedural steps and all the relevant landowners have been communicated to in recent weeks. Procedural steps to acquire the land was required for the scheme to be completed, and as I said, Scottish ministers will take title to the land on the 21st of April 2025. And that, because we have completed those procedures, helps us in identifying the funding routes and the potential funding mechanisms. And importantly, in terms of the timetable, which again is the focus for the petition, is the determination as to whether a smaller project starts with the bypass itself, whether there's a longer piece or which sections are done. That will help determine the timetable. And I have been as open as I can be, and I have been previously in trying to lay out what the procedures have been. But that public inquiry with 127 objections was obviously a key issue for this process, which isn't necessarily the case for the other projects that we're talking about.
Well,
it's one very we're running time, but one very small supplementary.
Okay, well, we can agree to disagree about that, but could I try and be helpful and make a suggestion? Ms Bailey may have an interest in this as well, which is this, and I'm thinking ahead to the work we may be doing together in the next session of Parliament. And that is that we might want to take a leaf out of the book of the approach in Germany, when in 2003 they published a plan of all roads infrastructure projects that were to be conducted by 2030. They laid out that plan. That had the benefit of giving certainty to the public, assurance to the contractors that the work would be available in a continuous stream over those nearly 3-decade periods. And it also served to take the heat out of this political debate, because all of us support projects in our own part of Scotland. And therefore, the nation came together to produce one plan. So whether it's yourself, Cabinet Secretary, whether it's Ms Bailey or whoever happens to be the Cabinet Secretary, I no longer harbour such ambitions myself, of course. Surely it would be sensible to do this better in Scotland, because the way we're doing it at the moment, every part of Scotland is disappointed to some degree But we all reckon that we can't do everything at once, and the long-term plan surely would be a far better approach for the next few generations ahead.
Okay, thank you, Mr Ewing. I mean, that peroration probably is a fresh petition in its own right, but I will allow the Cabinet Secretary just an opportunity to respond.
In that spirit of positivity and constructive suggestions, I think the member makes a very important point. Of course, you'll know the distinction with Germany as an independent country. It controls all of its provision in terms of what it can raise. And why is that important? Because the fluctuation we've had recently in terms of our capital budget has caused issues. I'm very open about that, but also causes issues around long-term planning. And I think that idea of having long-term infrastructure investment, whether it's on road, whether it's rail, is absolutely essential. Why? Because it helps you drive projects, but also it gives certainty to investors. And certainly I know from the rail aspect, that regular pipeline of investment is very important. Why we can't do that immediately, I think he's suggesting it for the future, is that we still don't even know the capital spending review issues that we're likely to get from the UK government. We're expecting that in the summer. That will inform the infrastructure investment plan. So partially what I can say is the infrastructure investment plan, which is, I think, currently due to the autumn, but again, it will depend on what the UK government says and the timing it has in terms of its capital, will provide some view. But that will not be the time frame, and it will be a multi-year time frame. But I think if he was saying a 30-year time frame, that's something that I would thoroughly want to be able to do if I had the full levers, as understanding what capital I can raise, where I can get that, what can I do in terms of borrowing, all the different aspects that actually in a devolved parliament you have less control over. But in principle, it's exactly what you should be doing in terms of infrastructure and investment.
Thank you very much. We've covered a real range of petitions, and actually that's been very helpful, I think, to the committee in taking forward in the time we have left on a number of them. Maybe some others, there's still controversy ahead. Is there anything further you'd like to add, or do you feel you've managed to convey everything that had to be said in the time that we've spent together?
Just thank you, and I know everybody, the South West wants to have itself and seen as a priority. Other parts of the country want themselves to be seen as a priority. I think the challenge for any Cabinet Secretary, and particularly for transport, is people feel passionately about their places and they want to pursue best by the constituents. So I know I can't please everybody all of the time, but I just want to reassure the committee that I've given it every attention since I became Cabinet Secretary for Transport in trying to get momentum and progress on a number of all these areas, including the ones you've identified today in these petitions.
So thank you, Lawrence Shackman, Alistair Graham, Nicola Blaney and Cabinet Secretary for your time this morning, and also to Jackie Bailey and Emma Harper, who have joined us to take forward the consideration of the assorted petitions. Thank you all very much, and I'll suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave. That brings us to agenda item 3, consideration of continued petitions. And in order to facilitate colleagues who are joining us this morning, I'm going to take petition number 2085, which is to introduce a statutory definition of residency for fatal accident inquiries into the deaths of Scots abroad. first and out of sequence. We're joined this morning by Michael Mara. I'll refer to him again in a moment. Bob Doris has just advised the committee he has an interest in this petition too, is on his way. And I see Tess White is in the gallery together with the petitioners themselves. This petition is a statutory definition of residency for fatal accident inquiries into the deaths of Scots abroad, lodged by David Cornock. And the petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to introduce a statutory definition for fatal accident inquiries into deaths abroad. As I mentioned a moment ago, we've been joined by Michael Mara, by Tess White, and I believe also potentially by Bob Doris. And we last considered this petition at our meeting on the 15th of May 2024. When we at that time agreed to write to the Scottish Government, to the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service, to Police Scotland and the relevant legal stakeholders. The Law Society of Scotland, the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service, together with the Scottish Government, consider that the definition of ordinarily resident in common law is widely recognised and accepted. The First Minister's submission explains that officials have been working on this issue with the Crown Office and reached the conclusion that it was not necessary to change the law at the present time. Similarly, the Law Society of Scotland's response states that it does not consider that it would be necessary or desirable to develop a bespoke legislative definition for the purposes of fatal accident inquiries. The petitioner's written submission reiterates his position that the ordinarily resident definition is not understood, is vague, untenable and arbitrarily applied. Now, the committee is aware that the system of coroner's inquests used in England and Wales is significantly different to the Scottish system of death investigations. In England and Wales, a coroner's investigation will take place where the death was violent or unnatural, the cause of death was unknown, or the deceased died in state detention. The inquest will mainly determine how, where, and when someone died. Coroners will rarely make wider recommendations, but can do so through a Prevention of Future Deaths report. In Scotland, fatal accident inquiries aim to establish what happened and to prevent future deaths from happening in similar circumstances. Fatal accident inquiries take place in limited circumstances and at the discretion of the Lord Advocate, where a death was sudden, suspicious or unexplained, or gives rise to a serious public concern, and she, the Lord Advocate, considers that it is in the public interest to hold a fatal accident inquiry. The Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service has a role in investigating a wide range of suspicious deaths. However, only a small proportion of those are deemed to require the level of public investigation that is delivered by a fatal accident inquiry. Now, in relation to residency, the UK Minister for Victims and Violence Against Women and Girls explains that in England and Wales, a coroner's jurisdiction is based solely on the deceased person's body lying within their coroner area. Therefore, where a person dies outside England and Wales, regardless of whether they were previously resident, the coroner's jurisdiction is engaged if the body enters the coroner area and the death is reported to the coroner. The UK Minister's response also provides information about the number of inquests into deaths abroad and the number of these cases in which a Prevention of Future Deaths report was issued. The petitioner has outlined a number of improvements that are being progressed as a result of his campaigning work. The Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service is working with the Death Certificate Review Service and Police Scotland to produce new guidance on reporting and investigating deaths abroad. A Memorandum of Understanding on Investigations Abroad is being created for the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. The website has been updated with contact details for the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit. So before I ask colleagues where we might consider going, may I in the first instance invite Michael Mara if he'd like to speak to the committee.
Convener, can I begin by thanking the committee for its continued interest in this petition. Speaking to MSPs across the Parliament, I know that there are many MSPs from right across Scotland who have constituents who this issue affects. So there's considerable interest in it, I think, across all political parties. Can I say that we're joined today by David Cornock and his wife Margaret, and I want to pay tribute to Davy, as he's known to me, for his campaigning work work. You've outlined, Convener, some of the changes that he's managed to obtain, but we should recognise that this is at a time of continuing grief for his family, and again, it's a circumstance of great challenge for them. So I would pay tribute to them for their work. So since I last spoke in support of the petition at the committee on 15th May 2024, you have received, as you've outlined, Convener, a considerable amount of correspondence from key stakeholders. Police Scotland highlighted that the decision to hold a fatal accident inquiry into a death abroad lies solely with the Lord Advocate. The Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service stated that while it is correct that the COPFS can conduct inquiries short of a fatal accident inquiry in relation to deaths abroad, that relies on the person being ordinarily resident in Scotland. The Law Society of Scotland stated their view that the concept of ordinary residence is widely recognised and accepted. The First Minister confirmed the Scottish Government's position that it was not necessary to change the law at present. But the UK Government Minister for Victims and Violence Against Women and Girls supplied statistics which showed that around 1,500 deaths abroad of people from England and Wales were reported to the coroner annually, with between 200 and 400 inquests concluded on deaths abroad in each year since 2016. Meanwhile, in Scotland, since the Inquiries into Fatal Accidents and Sudden Deaths Scotland Act was passed in 2016, not a single fatal accident inquiry has taken place into the deaths of Scots abroad. So with 200 to 400 inquiries concluding in England and Wales each year, it is simply not credible to suggest that in the last 9 years that there will have been no such cases of Scots in relating to Scotland. The evidence suggests that Scottish families are being denied justice. Convener, you outlined in your opening remarks, I think, some of the key differences in the system. We recognise that there are differences in the system, but the outcomes for people are the key issue here, I think, for the committee to consider in its work. So we have, I think, reached a point where your committee inquiries and correspondence received have made it clear the Inquiries into Fatal Accidents and Sudden Deaths Scotland Act 2016 is not meeting the needs of Scottish families. Whether or not the legislation has met the Scottish Government's intentions is another question. So at this stage, I believe that it's only right the committee considers asking the Lord Advocate and the appropriate Scottish Government Minister to come and tell the committee and bereaved families across the country why they believe the current situation is satisfactory. I believe it is entirely unsatisfactory, and I know that there are many, many grieving families who agree with me.
Thank you, Mr Mara. I should say that we understand the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office has provided information on requests into deaths abroad to Dave Dugan MP. The Foreign Commonwealth Development Office's figures reflect the number of requests it has received for documents to assist with coroners' inquests, rather than the number of inquests that have taken place, which accounts for the discrepancy in the numbers which the committee have received in response to our own formal inquiry. And thank you, Mr Mara. I think it is the case that these things considered in the abstract may seem to be one thing, but individuals who then find themselves having to deal with the system find it really wholly unsatisfactory in the way in which they then find themselves having to work their way and navigate through. Mr Doris has joined us this morning. Bob Doris, good morning. Welcome to you. So we did begin the proceeding in this petition just ahead of your arrival, but I wonder if there's something you would like to say to the committee as well in relation to this petition.
Firstly, my apologies for not pre-notifying Mr Mara that was coming along. My involvement today actually comes from my constituent Julie Love, who contacted me and made me aware of this petition. Remiss of me, I didn't know until now. Julie campaigned, and myself and Julie campaigned ahead of the Cullen inquiry that brought in the change in the law for fatal accident inquiries to give the Lord Advocate, the Crown Office, the discretion in exceptional circumstances for deaths abroad to be subject to an FAI. So clearly I've got an interest, and my constituents got an interest in making sure that the system works as it was intended at the time. I should first of all say that I really offer my sympathies to the family that Mr Mara is representing. I know Julie lost her son, Colin Love, several years ago now, but it still feels as if it was yesterday, and she had wished there had been a fatal accident inquiry at that point. My only observation would be, from a very quick look at the evidence, Convener, is that whilst we might not need to define in legislation the term ordinarily resident, I would want to know that that's not restrictive, and that the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office, if they deem someone not to be ordinarily resident, if it was still in the public interest, they would be able to investigate appropriately and ultimately have a fatal accident inquiry. So I totally understand why that definition is there. Back in 2016, we didn't want to see, I hate to say glib community, it's not my intention at all, the thousands of expats that have maybe made life in Benidorm and Spain and elsewhere been subject to fatal accident inquiries when they passed away. So that was one of the reasons ordinarily resident was placed in law, but that's clearly not the case in the situation of Mr Marra's family that he's supporting, and I would want to make sure that the law is working as it should be. So I would want an assurance, I think, that the Lord Advocate and the Crown Office have got a discretion and a flexibility to action investigations should they wish to, and they weren't duty bound to follow a definition of ordinarily resident that's restrictive.
Thank you, Mr Torres. That's helpful. Colleagues, do we have any suggestions as to how we might proceed, having considered the issues that have been raised? Yes.
Convener, I find this actually really quite difficult, but in the light of evidence that we have had and the responses that we have had, I don't know if the committee could take it any further. And I would like to consider closing the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Law Society of Scotland, the Crown Office and the Procurator Fiscal Service and the Scottish Government consider the definition of ordinary residence in common law is widely recognised and accepted. Disputes about whether someone is an ordinary resident in Scotland can be taken to court, and the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service have progressed improvements on issues, including new guidance on reporting and investigating deaths abroad and a new memorandum of understanding with the Foreign Office, Commonwealth and Development Office.
Okay. I'm in the awkward position of not knowing that I entirely agree in this instance.
I wonder if we could add that, if the committee could just write and...
I mean, could we not write to the Cabinet Secretary, just, for Justice and Home Affairs to seek her views on the merit of the systems that operate in England and Wales? And we have established a practice of, we had the Cabinet Secretary for Transport today. We're going to be seeing the Cabinet Secretary for Health immediately after the summer recess. So I just wonder, in the light of any response we got, there might not be an opportunity for a round table with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice later in the Parliament, where we could potentially just draw these things finally to her attention.
I will bow to your wisdom, Convener.
Mr Chowdhury?
I agree with yourself. We should write to the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and Home Affairs, and I think we should keep this open till then.
Would you be willing to allow that, Mr Torrance, to support that, Justin?
I will withdraw my recommendations.
Well, we'll keep the petition open. We will write to the Cabinet Secretary just drawing the suggestions that have been made, and maybe just suggest that it would be something that the committee would be interested in having a more direct engagement with the Cabinet Secretary before the end of the Parliament, maybe together with responses we've received to other justice petitions at that time. Our colleagues agreed? We are. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That brings us back to petition number 1885, which is to make offering community shared ownership mandatory for all wind farm development planning proposals. This petition has been lodged by Karen Murphy, and it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to make community shared ownership a mandatory requirement to be offered as part of all planning proposals for wind farm development. It was last considered on 26th of June last, and at that time we agreed to write to the Minister for Energy and the Environment. We've received a response from the Minister for Climate Action, which states that the Scottish Government continues to explore all avenues to enhance the provision of community benefits and shared ownership. The response highlights the use of devolved tax powers to provide non-domestic rates relief for renewable energy producers. And under the Renewable Energy Generation Relief, up to 100% rates relief is offered for those providing community benefit. The petitioner's written submission emphasises that this demonstrates the Scottish Government's ability to use tax powers to increase community shared ownership. However, her view is that it is not an effective scheme She points out that the developments with profits over £4 million are offered a 2.5% relief in non-domestic rates and argues that this is not sufficient as an incentive for developers. The Minister's response also states that the Scottish Government continues to engage with the UK Government on a range of areas which support communities to benefit from energy transition, including shared ownership and consideration of mandating community benefits. Mr Ewing.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I know that Gillian Martin has taken a close interest in this, and from statements in the Chamber and outside the Chamber that she has a keen interest in pursuing this. I am aware of a number of dynamic developments that are taking place at the moment. For example, in the Republic of Ireland, I believe they now mandate community benefit at the rate, in effect, of €8,000 per megawatt. That's compulsory. Here, the £5,000 per megawatt is not mandatory because there is no legal powers to do so, as has been noted by the Scottish Government. There is, however, a movement in that. I understand, I've just been informed of this yesterday by a senior official at HIE, that SSEN are to set up some model of community benefit for upgrades to pylons and infrastructure, which currently is not applicable. So that's a new development, and I'd be keen to find out more about that. In addition to that, there is at least one offshore wind developer, namely Blue Float Energy, together with Nadara, N-A-D-A-R-A, who are considering and promoting community ownership for offshore wind. And that would be an example that many other projects may wish to follow, which could have enormous importance. And finally, coupled with that, I understand that the UK government is not unsympathetic to some kind of scheme for community ownership, and one wonders if that might actually be one of the most practical purposes for which GB Energy's funding could be used, possibly along with the Scottish National Investment Bank, and HIE themselves have a close interest in taking all this forward, because so much of the activity is in the Highlands and Islands Convener. So, although I appreciate we're moving towards the end of this session of Parliament, I think that all of these developments, and probably others of which I'm unaware, indicate that I would be keen to write again to the Acting Minister for Climate Action to ask for further information as to when the energy strategy and just transition plan will be published, whether specifically it will contain proposals for this and some detail of the work that's being done, I believe, with the UK government, and possibly a ministerial statement at some point, perhaps in the autumn. I think the growing interest in this throughout the country, the growing concern about some aspects of renewable energy and visual impacts in Aberdeenshire, the Highlands and many other parts south of Scotland is such that, you know, I think that this is an idea whose time has come, and if we don't get on with it now, we in Scotland and Britain will be losing a trick. So I'm sorry to go on about this for so long, but I do think there's compelling reasons to keep this petition open and to allow the petitioners a full opportunity to benefit from what seems to be a congenial political environment now.
Thank you. Mr Ewing's made proposals. Mr Golden.
I agree with Mr Ewing. I think as part of the response from the Scottish Government, it would be useful to know, I think Mr Ewing mentioned some of the more formal mechanisms, but there may well be some informal mechanisms in terms of engagement to encourage community benefit overall. I think the petition's relatively narrow in it, but actually, you know, shared ownership, making it mandatory. I know for some wind farm developers that obviously can affect the asset base for the developers, but it might be that in the wider scope of community benefit that meets some of the requests of the petitioner. So I think it would be useful to get on record, I mean, particularly given we don't know when the energy strategy will be published, what the overall approach to community benefit in the round is.
Okay, so we have proposals keeping the petition open, making inquiries as have been suggested by Mr Ewing and Mr Golding. Are we agreed? We are, so we'll keep the petition open on that basis. Petition number 1919 to ban the sale of high caffeine products to children for performance enhancement. This has been lodged by Ted Gourley. And my eyesight's a bit vague, but he may be with us in the public gallery this morning. I think he is. A warm welcome to you, Mr Gourley. The petition calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to ban the sale of fast-relief caffeine gum to under-18s for performance enhancement due to risk of serious harm. Colleagues will remember we considered this petition at last on the 15th of May 24, and at that time we agreed to write to relevant stakeholders. The committee subsequently wrote to Team Scotland, the UK Youth Development League and the Scottish Schools Athletic Association to seek their views on the issues raised by this petition and to ask whether they were aware of any issues with young people using fast-release caffeine products to assist their performance. And I think we asked these questions in the light of a suggestion that there wasn't really an issue to pursue, but the committee felt that indeed there in fact was. We've received a response from Team Scotland which notes that while caffeine is not a banned substance, it was on in the World Anti-Doping Agency's 24 monitoring programme. Team Scotland go on to say that if this position was to change, then education to selected athletes would be adapted. The response also states that Team Scotland is not aware of such products being promoted at sporting events where young people are present or competing, and they are not promoted at Commonwealth Games Federation, Commonwealth Games Scotland sanctioned events. We've also received a submission from the petitioner, Mr Gourley, expressing his disappointment that the responses have not been forthcoming from other youth sport organisations, and shares his ongoing concerns about the dangers of caffeine gum and its use for performance enhancement. Difficult, but I mean, we've got pretty clear direction here from the organisations to whom we've wrote. We've not heard from others, so I mean, I'm wondering if there's much in the light of this, irrespective of the committee's engagement with the issues that have been raised, what more there is that we are going to be able to now achieve. Do colleagues have any suggestions? Mr Torrance?
Convener, in the light evidence or lack of evidence that we have had as a committee, I wonder if we consider closing the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that responses to a consultation on ending the sale of energy drinks to children and young people did not raise any issues associated with fast-release caffeine gum. UK Athletics Supplement's position statement provides athletics with clear advice on how to reduce risk in supplement use, which would include fast-release caffeine gum, and the Scottish Government previously indicated it will not be pursuing research on fast-release caffeine products at this time.
The committee agreed? Yeah. So, I mean, all credit to Mr Gourley for raising the petition with the committee, but in view of the responses we've received, it's difficult for us as a committee to see where else we can take the petition forward. If the position changes, then of course a fresh submission in the next Parliament would allow a fresh take at that time, potentially with a different government with different attitude. But at this stage, I think the committee feel we've got no option in the time left to us but to close the petition at this point. So we thank Mr Gourley very much for engaging with the committee, but regrettably that is the position we're in. We're not the government. We're only here to see what we can do to advance petitions, and sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. Petition number 2030 to review cultural funding arrangements to enable Scotland to contribute to the Venice Biennale in 2024, of course somewhat past now, and we last considered this on the 15th of May 24, and we agreed to write to Creative Scotland at that time, and the committee has received a response from Creative Scotland dated June that year, confirming that Scotland and Venice project was paused for 24-25 to allow a period of reflection and review. The review was considering a range of options, including returning to presenting at the Venice Biennale of 2026, the cessation of the Scotland and Venice project, occasional rather than regular participation, and a range of venue models. As members will note from the papers, the review of the Scotland plus Venice project concluded in July 24, with Creative Scotland providing a further update in the 6th of March 25 to let us know that Scotland and Venice partners will publish the 24 review in the coming weeks and set out its plans for the project in 26. The response goes on to say that despite the pause on the Scotland plus Venice project, the partner organisations have continued work to identify opportunities for artists, curators and producers to engage with the Biennale in 2024, and did secure Scottish participation in the professional development programme offered by the British Council Fellowship in Venice. In the light of all of that, do colleagues have any suggestions for actions? Mr Torrance.
Thank you, Convener. I think the petitioner has achieved their aims, though slightly later than what they would wanted. So under that, and the evidence that we've been given, I wonder if we can consider closing the petition under Rule 15.7 of Standing Orders on the basis that the Scottish Government has published its international cultural strategy, which noted the reviews was underway and states that Scotland plus Venice has been an important platform through which showcase Scottish creative practitioners. The review into Scotland's participation in the Venice Biennial has now concluded, with Creative Scotland and partners expected to publish the review in the coming weeks and set out plans to participate in the Scotland plus Venice project in 2026.
Thank you, Mr Torrance. Proposal to close the petition on the basis suggested. Is the committee agreed? The committee is. That brings us to the last of our continuing petitions, petition number 2091, to provide funding to have a CAMS worker and nurse based within Scottish high schools, lodged by Kirsty Solomon on behalf of Stand With Kyle Now. And it calls on the Scottish Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to provide funding to enable a CAMS worker and school nurse to be placed within our secondary schools. We last considered this on the 12th of June last, when we agreed to write to the Scottish Government. The Scottish Government commissions 6 monthly reports from local authorities on school counselling services, which asks for the number of young people accessing counselling, broken down by gender and year groups. The Scottish Government submission states that authorities are encouraged to share additional information if it is available, such as waiting times. It states that some concerns have been raised about capacity from authorities, but no concerns have been raised about young people's needs not being met. The submission highlights the work of the Counsellors Coordinators Network, which has been considering the recommendations of the Children and Young People's Commissioner, Scotland's report on counselling in schools. Lastly, the submission states that the school nurse role was transformed in 2018 to focus on areas most likely to impact a child's health and well-being. The Scottish Government undertook 2 surveys which looked at how this transformed role had been implemented across Scotland's health boards. Now, that report found that 97% of school nurses said that referrals under emotional health and well-being made up a high or moderate proportion of all referrals they received. Health Board responses to the survey suggested that the high level of referrals school nurses received under emotional health and well-being highlighted a cohort of children that had needs beyond the remit of school nurses, but that did not meet the threshold for child and adolescent mental health services, CAMS. Before I invite suggestions, so I wonder, colleagues, in the light of that, if there are any suggestions as to how we might proceed. Mr Torrance?
Thank you, Convener. In light of evidence, I wonder if a committee would consider writing to the Minister for Social Care, Mental Wellbeing and Sport to ask, in light of the findings of its report on the transformed schools nurses role, what action the Scottish Government intends to take on mental health support for young people in schools, in particular what action it will be taken to address the gap identified between the remit of school nurses and the CAMS referral threshold. Also, for an update on the Counsellors Coordinated Network's consideration of the recommendations made by the Children and Young People's Commissioner Scotland on counselling in schools.
Colleagues, a suggestion we keep the petition open and write as suggested by Mr Torrance. Are we agreed? Agreed. We are agreed. That brings us to agenda item 4, consideration of new petitions. We have 2 new petitions to consider this morning, and as always, for those who might be joining us remotely, we seek the advice both of the Parliament's independent research body, SPICE, and also an initial view from the Scottish Government, simply so that we can progress the petition at our first consideration. Petition number 2135 to implement the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the ICCPR in Scottish legislation, has been lodged by Henry Black Ferguson on behalf of We Collect Scot, and it calls on the Scottish Government to ensure that prior to the next Holyrood parliamentary election, this international covenant is given full legal effect in the devolved lawmaking process. The SPICE briefing explains that the international covenant was adopted in 1966 and ratified by the UK in 1976. Many of the rights set out in the ICCPR are reflected in international agreements and have been incorporated in UK human rights related legislation. The Scottish Government's response to the petition states that it is committed to a new human rights bill and will incorporate further international human rights standards into Scots law. The Scottish Government has developed and consulted on proposals to give effect to the recommendations from the National Task Force on Human Rights Leadership, which comprised a range of experts and stakeholders, including the Scottish Human Rights Commission. Now, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights was not one of the treaties the task force recommended for incorporation, although it did recommend that further consideration be given to restating the rights contained within the Human Rights Act of 1998. The submission explains that when incorporating international treaties into domestic law, the Scottish Parliament can only give effect to provisions within its powers and responsibilities. This route cannot be used to effectively extend the Parliament's powers by claiming that the incorporating international treaty provisions now allow the Parliament or the Scottish Government to do anything that would have been previously beyond the Parliament's devolved competence. The petitioner's submission questions the position of the Scottish Government, stating that the issue of devolved competence is not relevant to full implementation of the Covenant. He believes that the Scottish Government's submission seeks to restrict and undermine the sovereignty of the Scottish people. Well, do colleagues have any comments or suggestions for action? Mr. Ewing?
Well, I've studied the response of the petitioner to the Scottish Government's written submission of the 31st of January. The petitioner's written response is 13th of March, and it does raise a whole series of issues, some of them somewhat technical and legal, but the thrust of it is that the petitioner does adduce various examples of statements, notably by the First Minister in 2023, when it was stated that there should be a right to participate in public affairs as expressed in Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the petitioner has highlighted originally that the MSPs continue to ignore the Parliament's motion of September 2012, which acknowledges the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs. The petitioner also challenges the view that this matter is not within the devolved competence of the Scottish Parliament and refers to the Scottish Human Rights Commission as endorsing that view. I do think that, without rehearsing the whole of what the petitioner has said on the 13th of March, that it does raise further issues of substance that I feel the Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson himself should be asked to comment on further, to do justice to the petitioner. This is the first time we have considered this matter, and I do think the petitioner is perhaps right when he states that it's disappointing that the reply from the Scottish Government was not issued by Angus Robertson but was issued by an official, and perhaps Mr Robertson could be asked to give detailed comment on all the arguments which the petitioner set out in response to the initial Scottish Government position. I appreciate this will take more time, Convener, but this is the first calling of the petition, and I think that the issues raised are substantial and a mixture of political and legal and technical, so I won't add to that as I could to quote extensively from the petitioner's detailed and very helpful submission, but I do feel that it requires a further response from the Scottish Government.
Mr Golden?
I would echo Mr Ewing's comment. I think as part of that response, it would be useful for the petitioner and indeed Parliament to understand what the Scottish Government's position is on the codification and enablement of international law in a devolved setting. We have a position from the Scottish Government on alignment with EU law, but I'm unclear as to how international law in the devolved setting is to be adhered to. I appreciate that. So I'm not asking for a treaty by treaty, but I also probably want to note that tomorrow there's a debate in Parliament around the Aarhus Convention 1998 and how that is being enabled in a devolved context. So it'd be useful to know the overall approach, and then I do have concerns that it may not be practical in the timescales for the Scottish Government to adhere to it as the petitioner requests. However, it would be interesting to know what the overall trajectory would be.
Thank you. Well, in the light of that, I have to say my own preference would, having looked at this petition, was to actually move to close it. But respecting the views of our two colleagues, are the committee content to let the petition run on the basis of the further inquiry to Mr Robertson that has been suggested?
Yes.
Fine. That brings us to the final petition we're considering this morning, petition number 2140, to introduce a parking badge for pregnant women, introduced by James Bruce, calling on the Parliament to urge the Scottish Government to introduce a new parking badge to assist women being able to get in and out of their cars. I don't actually suppose that the parking badge would do that in itself, but nonetheless, when they are pregnant and for the initial months after their pregnancy. The background to the petition highlights that pregnant women can often face difficulty getting in and out of their car when the vehicle next to them has parked too close. The Spice briefing provides us with information on the Blue Badge scheme, which supports disabled people to access parking bays situated closer to where they wish to go. Members will likely be aware that the Blue scheme applies to on-street parking and does not generally apply to off-street car parks such as supermarkets. The briefing also includes information about the use of parent and child parking bays by pregnant women, with insurance companies and organisations such as Mumsnet and the Money Saving Expert suggesting that if you are heavily pregnant and you need to park in a parent and child space, then you should. In its response to the petition, Transport Scotland state that the Blue Badge scheme is designed to allow disabled people who experience severe barriers to their mobility to park closer to their destination, with the eligibility criteria based on functional mobility rather than diagnosed medical conditions. And while pregnancy and postpartum recovery would not automatically qualify under the legislation, individuals may still apply if significant long-term complications arise. The Transport Scotland response goes on to say there are no plans to create separate concessionary badges or to widen the automatic eligibility criteria of the Blue Badge scheme, and that decisions to offer alternative parking concessions for off-street car parks would be the responsibility of the relevant authority or landowner. Do colleagues have any suggestions as to how we might proceed? Mr Golden.
Thank you, Convener. I mean, I don't think there's far to go on this petition, to be blunt, but and I think there is some avenues to explore which might be helpful to the petitioner, including writing to the Scottish Retail Consortium to find out from their supermarkets and members what the position is on pregnant women accessing, whether it be disabled spaces or indeed parent and child spaces on their premises. It might be something we could do.
And I think we do that, noting that the Scottish Government has said it has no plans to create concessionary badges or to widen the automatic eligibility criteria for the Blue Badge scheme. So I think there's limited scope in respect of our ability to proceed in that regard. But let's take forward the inquiry as Mr Golden suggests. So we'll keep the petition open on that basis. And that concludes the public part of our meeting today, next to assemble on the 23rd of April. And we now move into private session to consider agenda items 5 and 6.